Hey ASLers, welcome back to another Initial Recce. This one's going to be from the first journal, ASL Journal, number one, Urban Guerillas, scenario J1, first scenario in that magazine. And I like this scenario for a couple of reasons that we're going to get into, but it's got a wild card with the partisan generation system that's part of the sniper role for the Russians, and which again just adds a nice little wild card element to the scenario because these are forces that you cannot account for as a German. You just know that they're likely going to crop up and probably in an inconvenient location. So you have to be aware of that. Excuse me. The other one is because it's late war action with SS and elite Russian troops. I like the late war scenarios just because the firepower capability, which is the two sides to every coin. They also have a good chance of being shot up as well because of the superior Russian firepower. But I like the late war action more often than not. This scenario here takes place in April 45, right at the tail end of the war in Europe. SS elements are basically forming a rearguard action to cover a retreat towards the west, where they hope to surrender to other Allied forces besides the Russians. Obviously, the SS and Russians don't get along, and the SS can look forward to brutal treatment from their SS from the Russian captors should they fall into their hands, which is one reason they fought so tenaciously against them. Regarding the partisans, the citizens of Vienna, because their city is historic and ancient, wanted to retain it in that condition as much as possible, made a deal with the Russians. Don't bomb our city and we'll help you fight off the Germans, which is what happened. Russians did not bombard the city, and the Viennese began sniping and interfering with the German actions and holding up their part of the bargain. On Scenario Archive, this has a good rating. I believe it's about 7.5 from like 80 something reviews, I think. So it's quite highly thought of in the ASL community, and balance wise, the win loss ratio is quite close. It's like 55-56 for the Russians wins, and around the 44-46-45 area for the German win loss ratio. So it's a slight advantage to the Russians, but it's a fairly balanced game. And because Scenario Archive also records war playthroughs, there's over 400 plays that have been accounted for to come up with that balance. So it's a nicely balanced late war scenario, which again is one of the bigger reasons why Dave and I are going to be playing this one next. Germans are scenario defenders, obviously, and Russians are on the attack. So the Russians basically have to collect two of three buildings. There's this large factory cathedral building. There's this building over here, and then another building over here, of which the Russians have to collect two. As I've said, this one here is a factory, a large multi-hex location, 2.5 level obstacle for lines of sight. No upper levels, so there's no first and second level. It's strictly ground level only. And vehicles are able to move on the interior, provided they come in through one of the two doors without bogging. So it's an interesting large cathedral in the center of the German defensive setup area that has to be taken by the Russians as quickly as possible. Then from there, they have to take one of these other two buildings. If you're capturing all three, the Germans have completely collapsed, but whatever that may be. You've got 6.5 turns as a Russian to achieve this. So I would say, and we'll get into those details as to why this is going to be, but you have to control this building by turn 4. If you do not control a building by turn 4, I don't see how you can then take this building, or maybe even this building here, unless you completely bypass it. Because the Germans are going to be setting up south of the canal area, and this line here, this is where the mainstay of your forces are going to be. If, for whatever reason, you have the opportunity of maybe bypassing it with your reinforcements and taking the latter two buildings, you don't even have to worry about this. But I see most playthroughs, this is where most of the fighting seems to occur, and for good reason, because it's central to the German defense, and it's such an obvious target. And because the Russians have so many troops and so much firepower, the more Germans you eliminate here, the less likely they are they're able to retake your captured buildings. So just to bear that in mind. Again, 6.5 turns, which is not a long time to root out those 658s and take those buildings. All right, let's look at setup and the SSRs. So the boards are 23 and 22, two city boards. 23 is the canal board. And you're only using A to P on board 22 and R to GG on board 23. So it's two half boards. Again, a nice small scenario with north being the small area north of the canal. There are two overlays that concern us here. One is a multi-level single hex stone building. So this has a first level because of the stairwell symbol. And this complex of buildings over here, it's a multi-hex, multi-level stone building. So there's a first and second level here, as well as a wooden outbuilding with a single level. Both could prove critical to some early German defense. And the Russian has the advantage of knowing where he's set up. So you can ignore probably one of these, probably this one here, and focus your efforts on taking this one here to support your assault into the cathedral. But again, we'll get into those factors as we get to them. Regarding the SSRs, we have 5 to concern us. First one is your standard ECs are moderate and no wind at start. Again, the ECs being moderate is not really going to play into things. I don't see a lot of fires developing, although given the high caliber of weapons being used, there might be a chance of rubbling and fire generation. So it is something to be considered. And with the orchards and woods burning relatively easily on, I believe it's a 7. Actually, woods are 8. No, the woods are 7. There might be a chance for some woods going up in smoke. We've already talked about the 2 overlays. And we've talked about the factory building location. Again, this is St. Stephen's Cathedral using the factory rules, so there's only ground floor. There's only 2 entrances for vehicles. And interior-wise, using the factory rules, this is only a line-of-sight hindrance. It is not a TM obstacle. So if I'm in this location and I want to fire to this location, I'm just paying a +1 for line-of-sight hindrance and a +1 TM for the interior building. So +3 from the outside, +1 from the inside. Something just to factor in. So yeah, that's a factory location. Next up is smoke discharger capability for the T-3485. So they have smoke dischargers and a depletion number of 6. Now, normally when you roll a 7 or more, you run out of smoke for the scenario and you don't get any more. But they've added an SSR which removes that limitation. And you have unlimited smoke discharger capability. So you can have 7 movement phases worth of smoke for each of your T-3485s. As long as you roll a 6 or less on your usage number. Interesting SSR number 4 is you cannot voluntarily abandon their vehicles. So this works against both sides because the Germans have to send units into this location at some point early on to gain positive control of the buildings and prevent just an easy walk-in from the Russians. Although it's inconvenient, you might use a half track, drop them over here, the crew can disembark, and they can fulfill that role. So they've added SSR to prevent that. Russians, for their part, can do the same thing. You drive a JS2 over to Y2, you disembark, and you take a building. So you cannot voluntarily abandon your vehicle, which means you got to stay in your vehicle and fight. And it's the infantry are the only ones that can actually control buildings. So very important to remember that. I'll be repeating that several times. The last SSR is probably the most interesting one for the scenario. It's a real wild card. Excuse me. As part of the Russian sniper activation number, which is a 6, which is pretty high. 1 to 2 gives you normal sniper results, and a 3 or 4 activates a partisan unit. Now, they're not very strong because they're only partisans, but on a 1 to 3, you'll get a half squad. 4 to 5 is a hero, and if you roll a 6, you get a 7-0 leader, so the Russians can use maybe an extra leader maybe help with some rallies or something. The way that they appear is you place using the Russian sniper as a base, you do a random location die roll. One die direction, the other side is distance, and that target hex in the vicinity thereof is where they appear. Now, they have to appear in a ground level location of a building, woods, or sewer hex, and it cannot contain an enemy unit. So if for whatever reason you come back here, maybe you're 88's in this location, you'd have to unhip him, and he would not be able to set up in that location. But hopefully that doesn't happen, and you don't give away your hip status too soon for your 88, because you're really going to need it. So more than likely, they're going to show up in a sewer location, possibly a ground level building that's not occupied by infantry. When they appear, they are marked with a TI counter, which means no moving, firing, advancing on their turn. So if they appear in the German prep fire phase, with all the German firing, it's very likely they're not going to be able to do anything until their turn and the Russian turn. Conversely, if they appear in the Russian advancing fire or defensive fire phase, I guess, or I guess it would be advancing fire with a morale check, they're going to be basically stuck there for the whole German turn, and they're going to be quickly eradicated, more than likely. But it's a wild card. It's you don't know when they're going to appear, where they're going to appear, what's going to appear, and you can roll Panzerfaust for these, because they have Panzerfaust capability, much like a German unit. So the half squad in 45 would need a 3 or less to fire against an AFV to see if they have a Panzerfaust, and which is 50-50 chance of one of those 127s being able to destroy your Panther, which would obviously suck for the German defense. You only get 3 Panzerfaust, and you do have to use capture use, so that limits their effectiveness. But again, the wild card nature, if that appears in your rear where you're not ready, it could be a bad day. And for example, if they take out your half track as it's ferrying troops around, I would say the 127 is definitely worth its weight in gold. They cannot form fire groups with the regular Russians, so they can only fire amongst themselves. And they're treated as allied troops, which basically impacts leadership. So should a Russian leader end up leading a partisan half squad, his morale is considered one less, and conversely as well. So that partisan 7-0 could act like a 6+1 if it's leading Russian troops for whatever reason. So in that case, you might want to use them in the back just to help rally troops. But again, it's a wild card that's makes the scenario quite interesting. I read a couple playthroughs where there was minimal or none, no partisans generated, and they ended up being German wins. So I'm not sure how critical it is to the Russian efforts. But it definitely helps them. It doesn't really hinder them. Again, it's something that the German has to deal with if they want a chance of succeeding. All right, let's look at the unit composition, and we're going to start with the attacker first. So the Russian order battle is basically going to be 18 squads. Compared to their German 10 is almost a 2-to-1 advantage for the Russians. And when you tack on the 5 tanks, it probably equals a 2-to-1 advantage, which is quite high in a typical ASL scenario. 13 of them are 4.58s, including 2 half squads, and 5 of them are going to be 6.28s, which come on as reinforcements in turn 3. You have 5 tanks to deal with, 3 initially, and then 2 that roll in with those reinforcements on turn 3. And they are the T-34-85 to start, and then the Joseph Stalin 2M comes on as a reinforcement. Let's look at the AFVs first. So the T-34-85 has 2 special ammo. One is APCR with a 6, and they have smoke dischargers which happen on a 6 or less as well. Because of the SSR, this smoke discharger use is unlimited. So again, you can have 7 phases where you drop it smoke, and it will definitely help cover the approach of the Russians. You've also got a 9-1 armor leader to stick on one of your tanks, which is going to help deal with your to-hit rolls. Hopefully you get a lot of rates of fire, even though it's only a 1, to help pen that Panther, which is probably going to be your biggest obstacle, at least initially. If you ignore the Panther and focus on blasting troops out, you're going to have a 16 firepower attack, which is quite lethal as well, considering the terrain effect's already been calculated into your to hit roll. So being able to blast troops out of the stone buildings is definitely going to be increased at the expense of tackling the armor. Depending where the German armor sets up, you may have a choice of getting to it right away and dealing with it, or you're going to have to deal with the infantry first and then eventually get around to dealing with the Panther, because it will nuke all your tanks. The kill numbers for the 85 long are 17 with AP and 19 with APCR. So the German has 2 tanks. He's got a Mark 4J with weak armor, and he has the Panther. The Panther has 18 frontal and a weaker turret for 14. So if you can get a turret hit on the Panther, 50-50 chance you'll probably get a pen. But if you hit the hull, more than likely you're not going to get a result, even unless you get criticals. So it's not the most powerful gun the Russians have. That's occupied by the JS2 with this 122, which we'll cover next. So the 122 has an AP of 25. It's got no special ammo. And obviously you cannot intensify with a breakdown of 11. So you're going to get a 1 shot per turn with the 122. Now, with the 25 pen of the 122, you're going to be able to deal with the Panther quite easily. You're definitely going to be able to destroy the Mark IV, barring a dud round. From front or side, it doesn't seem to matter. And if you get the Panther's hull hit, you might have a chance of penning it, probably 50-50, maybe a little bit more, like 60-40 chance of penning the front of the Panther. But it's a lethal tank for the Panther, and combined with the mobility of the T-34-85, you'll probably be able to deal with that German armor quite efficiently. Conversely, the tanks don't share the capability of weakness. So the T-34-85 is vulnerable to all German anti-tank weapons, especially the Panzerfaust and the Schreck. Even the 85 or 75 long with its 17 and the 88 with its 20 have a good chance of destroying your T-34-85 with a 1 shot. Of course, the 75 double long is even better. I think it's got a 23 pen. Your T-34-85s are not long from this world, so don't forget your smoke discharger use and cover your approach and give you some defense support. The JS2 is a mammoth, 26 frontal armor with a weaker turret structure of 18. So if you get a turret hit against you, most of the German guns, ordnance, has a good chance of penning. With the exception of the Mark IV, it's only got a 75 with a 17 to kill, so it cannot harm your vehicle at all unless it gets a flank shot. However, the armor on the sides and rear of the JS2 is only 11, so all the German defense weapons, again, will have no problem penetrating it. So you want to be aware of where all the Germans are. You want to stay at least 3 hexes away to avoid a good Panzerfaust shot. 4 would be better, and which of course you have the modifiers for your TIV rolls if you stay that far away. But at least your tank will live that much longer. If you get too close to the German infantry, they're going to start blasting you with Panzerfaust, and they're going to have up to 20 shots with Panzerfaust. So 4 shots per tank will probably see paid to all of them. Let's look at the Russian MMCs. So you have 12 full squads and 2 half squads at start in your setup area. So the setup area is this area marked by the black lines down to the bottom of the board for these forces here. These forces come on as reinforcements from one of 3 sides. Either they come on from the left, the right, or for some reason in the south. If they come on from the left or the right, they have to come on south of the canal system. So they cannot just make an end run and defeat all the German defenses. They must come in somewhere along these roads here. Your ELR is only 3, which is not great for 45. Yes, you are 8 morale troops, but when you start getting 2 morale checks, 3 morale checks, maybe the odd 4 check or K4s, then you quickly start deteriorating in quality. You step down to a 447 and then from there to a 426. So it's only 2 ELRs and your 458 is suddenly much weaker. And similar with the 628 as well. So you must make sure that you have leaders on standby, of which you've only got 3 at start, to help rally those troops and get them back into the fight as quickly as possible. Again, you have 18 squads combined at start. The German only has 10. So with that kind of ratio, it's going to be quite easy to overwhelm the German. They can only get so many final protective fire shots off before they break or get overwhelmed quickly. So don't be afraid of throwing your troops in to deal with those ones. Yes, they are 6.58s and they will hurt, but you have to break them and force them back as quickly as possible. If you can get the 6.28s in combats with the 6.58s, 1-to-1 odds, so it's quite achievable to get a good result in close combat. Now, hand-to-hand's not an effect, just close combat. So again, a 1-to-1 odds is a 5 or less, but you have a good chance of taking care of an SS squad that way. And because you have the numbers, you can afford to lose a couple in hand-to-hand or just losses in general. You have enough men that you can absorb lots of those losses. As I said, you've only got 3 leaders at start, one that comes on with your reinforcements. And the 9-2 is probably going to lead your assault. You could keep him back with the HMG as a fire base to help with fire lanes, but that's overkill. And you're going to get limited use on your fire lane anyways because the German's not going to expose himself that much. So it's probably better to throw the 9-2 in with the assault. Maybe give the 8-1 with the HMG and he can set up back. We'll get into setup positions in a second there. You've also got several LMGs, which will help your force, 3 DCs, and a flamethrower. Now you have. All right, let's talk about setup and position for the Russians. Now, as we said, this is the initial setup area for the Russians. This area here with all the said troops, an excellent spot for your LMG, your heavy and squad would probably be in this building right here. He's got an excellent fire lane all the way down to BB3. Any Germans that have to crisscross this area are going to get shredded with a neg-2 shot, even with dashing. Give him a 4.58 and he can help contribute out to 10 hexes away, and you can even get a 6 neg-2 shot, although again it'll be halved for dashing, so still a 2 minus 2 is quite effective. And with a high rate of fire of 3, there'll be lots of fire coming down. You give him a neg-1 leader, it makes it even worse for the Germans. So you effectively cut the battlefield into 2. Any German troops that are stuck on this side are going to have a very hard time getting across. Although they do have smoke grenade use, it's only a 2, so there is that chance. And likely they're going to use dashing as well. But there is an opportunity to cause some damage to the Germans. And at some point, the German defense is going to have to split, and they're going to have to send troops into this location here. And by covering this bridge, you're sending them the long way around. So there's a very good reason why to have it here. Alternate locations, it might be up here on the 2nd level, or even in this location. You can see over most buildings. This will obviously be an obstacle because it's too high, as will this building over here. But all the other ones, you have a chance of seeing over them. And especially the woods, you can eliminate most blind hexes, provided you have those kinds of line of shots. And if you're up here, it'll be much easier to bring some kind of suppressing fire to the Germans. We're probably going to be setting up behind these walls, at least initially. Your assault for the main body I would see going one of 2 ways. One is a cautious approach, which given the time constraint of 6.5 turns is not advisable. You could retain a lot of concealment and you could just slowly work away from building to building to building until you're in position to attack. That would take entirely too long and therefore not advisable. Using some combination of armored assault with the T-34s and their inherent smoke ability would offer plenty of protection for you to move in to those German positions and start doing a frontal assault that way. Again, which way you go is up to you, but there's plenty of covered approaches to the right, although you do have to worry about this nice open area where they could also be setting up fire lanes and ruin your day. But because you have the advantage of setting up after the German defense, you can plan your attack accordingly. So I can see some kind of combined arms, armored assault covering most of your troops while the rest of you guys are just moving from building to building. German defense, speaking of that, because it's going to impact everything. I can cover that now, I suppose, because it impacts the Russian setup. The German only has 10 squads. He has to detach 1 or 2, maybe 3 to secure these buildings so they're not just open for a Russian take, which means he's down to 7, maybe 8 squads in the vicinity of this area, of which he cannot deploy more than half forward, because if he deploys his whole force in this area, it's too easy to get some tanks behind him, cut him off, and then when you start breaking him, his route choices are very limited or negligible, and he won't be able to defend a factory well. It's just going to be wide open. So more than likely, you're looking at 3 to 4 squads are probably going to be deployed forward somewhere. Now, where would they set up? I could see in-depth positions, some kind of cover from fire. So places like this would look to be very optimal to me. You don't really care about the flanks. You don't want to deploy too much farther forward as a German, because for those reasons we just talked about. So these seem likely locations you can expect to see German troops for your pre-planning before you even see the map board. Again, it's unlikely he's going to keep everybody back here, because then you can just waltz up as a Russian and you're in place by turn 2 to start bringing fire directly to bear on the factory. He has to delay to some degree, so I can see 4 squads as a bit of a speed bump. You can focus your attack on either side, and be aware that at that point, the other side that's not being engaged will likely retreat back into the center. But it helps you deal with one area first with concentrated firepower and a good chance of hopefully breaking whatever troops are in those locations before they have a chance to retreat. You're going to have to take risks. There is lots of open ground, but using armored assault combination, again with that smoke ability, might help you get closer to where the Germans are, and then you can start dealing damage to them. Reinforcements for you, which again consist of the 5 628s and the 2 Joseph Stalins. You have 3 options with the red dashed arrows. You can come on from the left, right, or from the bottom, again south of the canal. The only option I see 95% of the time is this way here. There's no point coming on from the south unless for whatever reason it's a really horrific battle and you're making 0 progress and you need troops. But even then, why would you do that when you can come on from the flanks? So I see this as the primary means of the Russians advancing onto the border with the reinforcements. An alternative would possibly be this location, coming in from that way, because once you secure this side, you can detach part to support this attack, and you can send a couple guys across to secure those buildings. And if you can secure these 2 buildings quite easily, you don't even have to worry about the factory. So just be aware that you've only got 5 squads and 2 tanks, and there's a German 88 somewhere hiding around there that's probably going to be defending you. We'll get to that setup when we get to the Germans. But I would think 95% of the time I can see the Germans coming on this way. Depending on the German setup, however, there might be a 5% chance to come on this way. I see 0 opportunity to come on this way. It takes too long for you to get into where all the action is. You're much better, if you want to, just come on this road here or this location here if you want to cut off Germans. But again, most of the time I can see them coming in this way. It seems the most obvious. This is a good alternative, however, for the reasons that we've already discussed. All right, let's talk about the Germans. You have elite SS, and because they're elite, an elite unit, all depletion ammo for their guns are increased by 1. So the only real special ammo that they have is smoke and the smoke discharger that they have inherent in the two tanks. The 88 has no special ammo, and there's no APCR for the other guns. They'll just have as AP. The German force consists of 10 6.58s. You have 3 leaders, including a 9.1 and an 8.1, an MMG, 3 LMGs, 2 Schrecks at your defense. You've also got, don't forget this, inherent ATMM and Panzerfaust usage. And lastly, SS squads in 44, 45 get assault fire. So while it's not on the counter, don't forget you do have assault fire, so you can move and shoot quite successfully should you want to counterattack and push the Russians away, which is always an option. The Germans got 2 vehicles. One's a Panzer Mark IV-J, and the other one's a Panther, like the late war VG model. And there's also an 88 anti-air gun, not the AT gun, but the AA gun, which has a different caliber gun. And you got a half track. Now, to dispense with the half track right away, I can see it being used to ferry troops across the canal. Gives your Germans some protection from SMG fire. But any serious anti-tank weaponry or even the MG with a rate of fire of 3 has a decent chance of crippling or even destroying your half-track. But it's there for your use, probably, again, to ferry troops around. It does have a 3 firepower AMG, which you could fire group. But again, I see it mostly being used to ferry around troops. You also get 10 concealment counters to help. So you can use them partially to camouflage your frontline forces, those 4 squads we talked about. Or you could use them to set up dummy stacks for maybe your vehicles to throw off where the enemy is. For example, if you set the Mark IV inside the factory, give it a concealment, you can set up 2 concealment counters as the 5.8 counter as dummy stacks. So the attacker won't know what's the real deal. And again, if you use your Panther somewhere in one of these orchards, you can set them up concealed. And it's not a bad way of using him as well. More than likely, however, most of your Germans are going to be set up in the vicinity of the factory. And you've got 3 turns with your Panther to help deal with the T-34-85s as quickly as possible. Because come turn 3, you're going to have some JS2s rolling in from your flanks. The German units themselves, so we'll discuss that first. All German forces, with the exception of the 88, must set up south of the canal and north of row 7. So you have to set up in this area. What that means is at some point early in your battle, you're going to have to detach a couple of squads, maybe 3 on the outside, to head north of the canal to secure those buildings. You must have troops in these buildings at some point. Otherwise, the Russian could just walk in. How many you deploy is going to be how you're feeling. At least 2, I would say. Maybe a third. Maybe even give them an 8-0, just so that you can deploy into half squads if you want, with maybe only 2 squads. Again, how you deploy, that's obviously going to be entirely up to you. But you have to send some troops. Ideally, you should send them on turn 1 before the Russian gets into position where he can cut you off. And definitely before turn 3 when those reinforcements roll in. And if he rolls in this way like I think they would, they're going to cover this bridge. You're going to have a fire lane covering this bridge. It's going to be impossible for you to move troops without getting shot to shit. So in turn 1 and or turn 2, you're going to have to move something across the board north of the canal into those buildings, which is going to deplete your remaining forces on the ground. Again, you can maybe deploy 3 to 4 squads forward, some kind of defensive posture, just so that the Russian doesn't get to waltz in. But most of your troops are probably going to be just set up, hunkered around the wall, including your tanks, as you fend off the inevitable attack. Maybe keep the A1 centered in there for rally purposes. Speaking of the SS, so you're facing Russians. So some rules crop up. You do not surrender via heat of battle. You become berserk instead. You don't surrender in the rout phase for being adjacent. You're always going to low crawl away and or die for failure to rout. So there's no surrendering for the SS versus Russians. You also don't become disrupted. So the worst that could happen to your 658, he becomes 2 broken half squads. With 3 leaders, it's quite easy to reassemble into a full squad, provided you, of course, rally. Now, Remember, SS also have a increased broken morale of 9, and your half squads have a morale of 8, which is standard. So they're much easier to rally than your typical troops. You throw them in a building with a neg-1 leader, and you're looking at a 7 or less to rally. 50-50 chance, pretty well on the dice, unless you have on average dice like Dave and I apparently have, to rally your troops under DM, let alone when they're not DM. So it's they're quite easy to bring back and throw them into battle again. So just bear that in mind. Your ELR is underlined, which again means, and you have an ELR, your morale is underlined, and you have an ELR of 5, which basically means you're never going to be ELR'd. And again, the worst that could happen to you is you break into 2 half squads. You also attack on the 6 table. Now you throw in an LMG and suddenly you're on the 8 table. You fire group 2 of them, and you can be looking at 16 firepower attacks from 2 squads quite easily. And therefore, it's going to be quite lethal for the Russians to move into any kind of position to deal with you. You should be safe if you set up in this kind of formation, at least till turn 2, when the Russians might start advancing into these locations where they can start bringing fire down. And then they're just going to eventually wear you down. So at some point, your front line is going to have to pull back and retreat, take up position in the factory, and help try and restrain the German assault as long as possible. Again, you're going to have to avoid stacking as much as possible, just because you become a juicy target and you cannot afford to lose too many troops too quickly. The good thing about setting up in this formation is if they break, they can just retreat inside the building, rally with an 8-1 leader on a 7 or less, and on the next German turn, they're coming back into the fray. So it's a really quick turnaround on your broken units, and hopefully you can keep the Russian at bay for several turns. You've only got 3 leaders, so again, you're probably going to send 1 across the board, maybe, or you could really be heavy dependent. I don't see, well, I suppose there's an argument to be made if you set up in something like this, send a squad here. They're probably going to die until it's time to move, but again, you occupy this area, you have nice fire lanes down here, but it's going to be very hard for you to get back and join the main fight with this unit here. So depending on how the Russian decides to attack, this might be a viable solution. You could set him up in the front so he actually gets some initial attacks, but again, you're also susceptible to being shot at yourself. You may want to hunker back and set up that way. Again, you also got inherent ATMMs for close combat should you ever be able to jump on a Russian tank. It's unlikely that they're going to get that close because they're aware of your Panzerfaust ability. Speaking of the Panzerfaust, because it's 45, there's a -1 to your usage die roll against an AFV, which means you need a 4 or less, which is quite decent. You get a maximum of 20 Panzerfaust, and they have a range of 3, so it's -2 per hex beyond the origin hex. So you start off with a 10 and you go steps 2 all the way down. A 3x range, looking at a 4 to hit. Now, against a motion vehicle or one covered in smoke, it's going to be impossible to hit unless you get snakes. But the option is there to do that kind of stuff. And because the Russian is aware of that, he's going to stay away from you probably 3 to 4 hexes whenever possible, just to avoid being shot with a Panzerfaust. All right, let's look at the AFVs and the guns. So as we said, because this is an elite force, all depletion numbers for these vehicles are increased by 1. And unfortunately, that only really is the smoke discharger on both vehicles, which also acts like a combat shotgun in close combat, where if any Russians foolhardy enough to enter that hex, you can attack on the 16 firepower table with no TM and no LOS. Just a shotgun blast, 16 table, and it's going to cause carnage to any Russian foolhardy enough to get close. You do have a 9.2 to augment as well, but again, with no special ammo, this guy is probably going to be hunting T-34s for the first 2 turns, and then he should probably focus his efforts on the Josef Stalins because they're the bigger threat. With enough Panzerfaust in all your squads, you probably have a good chance of taking out all T-34s, barring any catastrophes. So you can focus your efforts on the heavier JS2. The Mark 4J has also smoke ability, so you can fire smoke, which might not be a bad use, especially if they set up an HMG in this location. You drop a smoke round on it, and he's smoked off for 2 turns, and it gives you plenty of opportunity to cover any kind of retreat you want to do, even working your way across the bridge to safety on that side. But it's not long for this world because the armor's so weak. Let's talk about the pen factor first. So the 75 long pens on a 17, which is good against a T-34-85. You need a 7 or 8 to get a result. 6 or 7, excuse me, to get a result with normal AP. The 75 double long is pens on a 23, so Swiss cheese on the T-34-85s, but you won't scratch the hull of the JS2 from the front. So you're going to try and get flanking shots whenever possible on the JS2s, but the T-34-85 is probably no problem to deal with. Now, how the Russian decides to use his armor, obviously, is going to depend on the player. They could go tank hunting with their T-34s, or I see them being used more to support the infantry assault by covering with them with smoke or the vehicle itself. They cannot afford to come forward and tank hunt too much, just because the inherent Panzerfaust that you have, you're going to be able to deal with it quickly. So I can see them staying back with their infantry, and therefore it's much easier for you as a German to pick them off as they come in one by one. Yeah, a good use for the smoke, again, like I said on the Mark IV, is to drop one maybe F10 or F9 and just smoke off the Russian positions so that they can't shoot you up, and allows you to adjust your defenses based on their setup for your turn 1 and or turn 2. So keep them in a decent position where you can affect the battle that way. You could possibly also start them up in a factory, maybe with a couple of dummy squads to represent other 5A counters, and just leave them there as a last-ditch close defense, which is certainly a possibility, especially with that combat shotgun. But he could also be used aggressively to pop smoke and thereby deny Russian fire lanes. So 2 ways to use him as well. Your 9.2 is likely going to be with the Panther just because it's the best vehicle out there and it's your tank killer. So with the Neg 2, it's going to compensate for a lot of your modifiers, and even moving, you'll probably get 3s or 4s might actually hit something. So it's not it's pretty good for a mobile tank destroyer. Again, you're going to get overwhelmed quickly because there's 5 Russian tanks and 18 squads. But should the opportunity present itself, definitely take advantage of it. Finally, we've got the 88. The 88 is the only gun, as I said, that can set up north of the canal, and or you can deploy it on the south. It's only the anti-air version, not the anti-tank version, which means its pen is only a 20, which is, again, great against the T-34, but it's not going to scratch the hull of the JS2. You have to get a flank or rear shot. So that means you're probably going to set it up in depth somewhere, hoping to get that shot because it can sit up hip and in place. Just remember that. All right, so as we said, you're looking basically for the side and or rear shots on the JS2s especially. I don't think very many T-34s are going to live to come into this area here, but they might, in which case they're easily penetrable by the front or the side. But the JS2 is definitely, you need to get a flank side shot, so you're going to have to hide your gun as much as possible. Now, because you can set up hip, the obvious locations to set up are this location, W2, because you offer a nice, without changing your covered arc, cover on both bridges, a lot of open ground, and at some point the Russian's going to have to present his backside to you to get those shots off. Now, he's probably going to be aware that there's something here. he may send some troops in to deal with that, but shouldn't you be able to keep it hip till you get that rear shot, you're probably guaranteed a hit. You're probably guaranteed a kill provided you hit. So this W2 is an excellent spot to hide your A gun. Next one would be E5, because should the off chance the Russian come in this way, for whatever reason, and you're set up in a proper covered arc, you have to choose wisely. Against flanking and or rear shots will kill the JS2, and it also offers cover for the bridge itself as well. Now the problem with this location is you have to pick the proper covered arc. That's probably the obvious one. You could also pick this maybe as an alternate one, or this one maybe as a third one, but because most of the action is going to happen over here, this might be a total waste on the off chance that he comes in this way, even when you're going to be firing under frontal armor, so you don't want to do that. So this one here or this one here are probably your choices that you're going to take. Now I mentioned it to be careful which one you select, because if you change covered arc position, you're no longer hip, and it gives the game away. Now there's also a penalty that's doubled for changing your covered arc in woods. Because you're a turreted gun, it's only going to be a +2, which is not that bad, but again, modifiers quickly add up, so you definitely want to be in the right orientation when the vehicle presents itself so you can blast it. So again, I can see this as a primary choice. I can see this one here as the primary covered arc if you're in this location. Other options are U3, maybe R4, and possibly FF2. That's a good location. This is a good last minute thing. It's probably guaranteed to stay hidden until the Russians get close. And once he gets close, you're either blasting him on the road, maybe hitting this building, and you're definitely going to be able to eradicate him in those buildings there with an 88. Should he get to this building, the game's almost up anyways, and he doesn't even have to enter this location unless you have troops. So just bear that in mind if you set up in one of these two locations here. Your gun's probably not going to get a lot of use unless it goes really bad for the Germans. So W2 would be my pick for first choice, maybe E5 as a second, and or U3 as a third. This kind of location here is probably not advisable, nor is anywhere in the front, because it's quickly going to get discovered and it's not going to get utilized. I could see the argument for this location here based on the Russian reinforcements rolling in. Either they're going to come down the garden path on the road and then you can blast them from the side, or you can come this way, and again, you may have to change your covered arc to get a shot off. But this might not be a bad option either. But I still think W2 is probably going to be your best advantage for the 88. You keep him back, you keep him hip as long as possible, and hopefully you get the optimal shot off before you're discovered. A last point about the infantry, and this applies for the Russian as well. And remember, it's the infantry that occupy control buildings. The victory conditions are controlling buildings. What that means is the Russian tanks, as a Russian player, are somewhat expendable. Don't throw them away, but it's the infantry that have to control buildings. So they must live to achieve that objective. And if that means sacrificing a tank to do that, then that's what you might have to do. Obviously, it's not preferable, but don't be afraid to throw your tanks away in the chances of keeping your infantry alive to achieve their objective. Conversely, with for the Germans, it's the infantry, Russian infantry, that have to be dealt with. If you have an opportunity, take out a Russian tank, but if you can break the Russian overshooting at a tank, you may want to take that shot instead, because if you keep them broken and away from the front lines, they can't harass you, break you, shoot you, and they can't control the building because you're keeping them away. Now, of course, that's the detriment to that, of course, is the heavy guns that the tanks have. The 85s and the 122s, a 16 and 24 table, respectively, will do business on you in your stone building. So, again, you have to weigh that chance. Just remember, it's the infantry that determine the victor in this game, and whenever possible, try and target them instead of the tank, especially if you're looking at a +4 to hit a moving tank over shooting troops. You may want to shoot at the troops rather than the Hail Mary shot. All right, let's look at the terrain analysis of the map. We're going to use the GeoInt OCOCA acronym. So it stands for Observation Fields of Fire, Cover and Concealment, Obstacles, Key Terrain, and Avenues of Approach. These are all different analytical tools that geomatics analysts use to help define the battle space and help mission planners come up with successful operations. Sometimes they don't consider stuff until these kinds of analyses are done. So let's look at observation and fields of fire first. Now, the Russian has the advantage because they set up second, and that means you can focus fire your efforts on the German defenses appropriately. Whether you set up your HMG on an upper level to deal with frontline troops or in the ground level is going to be dependent upon how they set up. Bear in mind that the factory is going to be the probably center point of the German defense, and if you can bring enough fire to bear, even from an elevated position on these defenders behind the walls, so be it. 6 firepower attack with a +2 is probably not that bad. You throw in a neg 1 leader, and it's only a +1 on the 6 table, and you're probably guaranteed to get some kind of results, especially with a higher rate of fire on the HMG. Again, for a Russian, setting up on the ground level in F6 is obviously probably the preferable position just because of this road open area here. It's a perfect fire lane. It cuts the board in two. Any Germans on this side now have to face a -2 shot across the road, barring any use of smoke grenades, which again, the smoke exponent of 2 isn't that great. You cover the bridge so reinforcements cannot pour over and occupy these buildings, thereby denying them to the Germans. They have to take the long way around, and therefore you can help interdict a lot better, and this can help support your attack. Your reinforcements. I favor this approach for the Russian reinforcements for 2 reasons. One is it covers the bridge. This MG covers this bridge, and you can move into these buildings here and help attack the factory. Once this has been neutralized, you're probably in a good position to jump across the bridge and start fighting for those buildings there. Conversely, if you come in from the right side as a Russian, occupying this building, say, you can provide cover onto that bridge, and you can help suppress anything behind those walls as much as possible. You move up into an upper level, and you can reach all these hexes here, and help eradicate the Russian or German defense. A good vantage point for CC7 is it also gives you a fire lane down this road, which prevents Germans from easily going over the bridge to support those buildings. And further, once this factory is dealt with, if you're in this location here, it's much easier for you to then take the eastern bridge and start securing those buildings as well. So I favor the left-hand approach just because it's more cover and more direct impact on the factory itself. This one here, you still have to stand off more like a fire base to help secure the thing. But this does offer the advantage of quick access to these 2 buildings up here. All right, the flip side to observation and fields of fire is cover and concealment. So this is going to apply to the Germans and marginally to the Russians as well. For the reason already discussed, the Germans are probably going to set up in depth and avoid frontline usage, primarily because it's too easy to get cut off and overwhelmed quickly. And if the Germans are losing troops too quickly, their defense is going to falter sooner than it should. So they're probably going to set up in depth, which gives you the option as a Russian of setting up concealed on the assault and then using cover and approach and moving up quickly and retaining your concealment so you can survive to get to the front lines as quickly as possible. The downside to that, however, is you only 6.5 turns, and you really have to be within that factory location by turn 3 and occupy by turn 4 at the latest. Otherwise, it takes too long to secure the other buildings north of the canal, barring a complete collapse of the German defenses there. As an attacker, there's lots of open ground that you have to cover. You do have 3 tanks with smoke dischargers that could help with that, and or provide armored assault cover. So it's not that critical of an issue, but you're still going to have to take the odd -1, -2 shot as you move closer to the German defenders. Bear that in mind. For a Russian, moving from building to building offers you lots of protection, but again, it's a time thing. It's going to slow you down. Bear in mind that the Germans are going to be attacking you with 6 firepowers likely, maybe 8 with an LMG. They could fire group as a 12 or even a 16, but those kind of instances are probably quite rare just because you have so many troops, and if you stay spread out, you can divert a lot of their fire and they won't be able to fire group on your ass. From a defender, setting up in depth helps to keep you out of the line of fire from that initial barrage. It helps you react a little bit better because you're not so far forward that you can fall back if required, or you can slip over to the left or the right side and support that attack if you're in one of those forward positions. But you have to give some kind of token defense forward just to prevent the Russian from just waltzing up and taking a position where he actually can impact you. Wall advantage around the factory is going to be critical, so make sure you use it when you get it. Don't forget to use the counters like Dave and I always do. Make sure you claim wall advantage and get that +2 TM because it's going to keep you alive that much longer. You do have the factory location in the center Y7 to fall back to and rally if you broke. And so make sure you have a leader set up in that location. Keep him concealed and he'll live that much longer. And again, once they're inside the building, it might be too late, but if you can trick the Russian to such a point that he can't have a concerted attack north of the canal, you've achieved your objective from that regard. SS also have inherent smoke grenades for with a usage number of 2. It's only 1 in 3 chance, however, it is a chance. And if you have to do a lot of movement to secure those buildings north of the canal, or if you just want to move around the board itself, getting a chance at smoke grenades should be utilized whenever possible. Remember your 88s to keep it hip and placed in a woods hex. W2 again is the optimal choice, I think, as it offers the best opportunities for fire. Keep it safe so that it can unload its ordnance onto the Russian MMCs and or the tanks should they present themselves. Looking at obstacles, this covers artificial and natural obstacles. The terrain effects of the building is going to help the German defenders stay alive. The Russians could use the buildings to cover their approach, but at some point they're going to have to be adjacent to this wall and they're going to be shot at. Hopefully by the time they're adjacent to this wall, all the Germans have retreated into the building and then they can claim wall advantage and get that kind of protection. But it's going to become definitely an obstacle. And then similarly, the bridges are going to become choke points. Choke points for the Germans because they have to send reinforcements onto the north side of the canal to secure buildings. For the Russians, you have to cross those same bridges to gain control of these buildings. So these become choke points, and if they're covered with some good fire, it becomes lethal to cross them because you have to cross 3 hexes, possibly at a negative modifier all the way before you can get off that line. So there's plenty of opportunity to get shot up in those choke points. So make sure that as a German, you're able to bring some kind of cover fire to them, and as a Russian for the same purpose, which again might be a reason why you set up in here or you send your reinforcements this way. You can't do both. It's got to be either or, so you're going to have to pick based on where the German is, but both are viable options to control access to the bridges, bearing in mind that probably at this point there's already going to be a couple squads north. You might get some terrain benefit from the bridge sides if an 88 opens up, but again, it's not a lot of protection. Once this gun opens up, it should probably become a focus for the Russians to try and neutralize it somehow, just so that it's not killing your troops that are here. The crew will be vulnerable, although they do get the +2 for being in place, but just bear that in mind when you're a Russian as well. So if you have an 88 covering these bridges, it's definitely going to be an obstacle to your approach. Regarding the buildings themselves, as an attacker, you're going to have to fire group probably to deal with the +3. A 4 firepower up 3 is not going to do a lot of damage to the troops inside. You're definitely going to have to fire group your main body. If you can get a 12 or even an 8 firepower attack, you have a much better chance of impacting whatever's inside that building. So make sure you do that. Again, don't stack because then you become a target. But if you can bring up your 85 longs to start blowing those Germans out of positions, let alone the JS2, with your troops there to help decimate anything broken, you'll definitely have a better chance of getting through those obstacles there. All right, key terrain, which is terrain that has to be gained at all costs, and this can apply to both sides, in order to achieve your objective. For the Germans, I see three key pieces of terrain. The first one, the most obvious one, is this factory. If you can hold on to this for 4 turns, maybe even 5, you delay the Russians' ability to penetrate north of the canal, and you definitely have to fight for this one as hard as you can for as long as you can. Although you're quickly going to be overwhelmed, possibly even encircled, as the Russians close the noose around your necks. The second key terrain is the bridges. Again, you need to use them to gain access to the north, and you also need to cover them so that the Russians have a hard time doing the same thing and getting across the building there. And then thirdly, building AA3 is definitely a key objective. This one less so, because if this one is achievable, then the defense is probably collapsed and it really doesn't matter at that point. You must defend this one as best as possible, either having a squad in this location so he can cover that, or this location so he can do the same. And that way you're able to bring some kind of defensive fire on anything that moves into this location while securing this building itself. So that's the 3 pieces of key terrain for the Germans. For the Russians, it's exactly the same. The Russians have to, I think, secure this building by turn 4 at the latest. It gives you 2.5 turns to cross the canal and fight for this building itself. With luck, you've eradicated most of the German defenses, and you can probably look at getting maybe 1, maybe 2 German MMCs, maybe a third one, if they really want to deplete the force at start, that you have to fight for. So if you do not control this building by turn 3 or 4, I see it very difficult for them to achieve that objective. Now, you do have a lot of guns in your beck and call, especially the 122s. Again, if you hit, you're on the 24 table for a result, and that will definitely kill Germans in those buildings. So I see the 3 same objectives for the Russians. You must control this building initially. You must secure these bridges initially as much as possible, either with the fire base or with your reinforcements, cut off the 2 bridges. And then you must secure one of those other 2 buildings in depth, dependent entirely on how the German sets up. He's likely going to have to split his forces. He must have units in each one, which depletes him even further, and you can focus your efforts on whichever building proves the most easiest to take. Lastly, let's look at avenues of approach. So these are approach routes that an attacker might take and a defender may use to realign, attack, or just adjust the way the battle is going. So looking at the attacker first, the center east side probably offers the best advantage points for the Russian. You do have 13 squad equivalents at start to pursue this side. I don't really see an attack coming up this way because it's too open, and it might take you too long to get into a good position to bring fire. With this way here, if you start in this location, you could have troops in this location right off the get-go, depending on where the German sets up, and you might even be able to advance into the woods at the end of the first Russian turn. And that gets you in a position to start bringing lots of defensive fire down and supporting your attack. Similarly, on the right side, lots of covered approaches. You can maybe even take a gamble into getting into this building. Maybe use your tank smoke discharger to drop some smoke in this location and help achieve that objective. Once you're in this location, you can use an upper level to bring fire to bear on all these hexes that you can see. And that'll help suppress the German defenders. So definitely an attack with your main body up the center or the right side is probably the best way to do it. If that's the case, your reinforcements really have 2 choices. The one I prefer is this way, to provide some kind of anvil for them to smash against, and or overload on the right side so you can help suppress this road. You can have easy access to these buildings, and you don't even have to capture this factory. you can just leave it, suppress the units inside it, while you focus all your effort on this location here. So both avenues definitely have their approach, but again, I favor the one on the left side just because it does a better job of cutting off this building from reinforcing anything north of the canal. Again, by turn 3, you could have troops in X4, blocks any chance of the Germans getting through, so it's whatever he gets through in 1 or 2, turn 1 or 2, that's going to be remaining for you to deal with as well. Regarding the Germans then, in a similar note, you're going to be setting up something like this in defilade position so you can bring down enfilade fire, and at some point you're going to have to retreat centrally located. Somehow you're going to have to make your way to the walls so you can have a central defense in this location. At the same time, on the first turn or 2, you must send units into these buildings to gain control of it. Otherwise, if all your forces are concentrated on the factory and nobody's up here, then the Russian defense can just, or assault can just come in and take it. So you must either use the half track to ferry troops later on, or send 2 squads with the leader in X4 and they can just occupy the buildings as they wish. Maybe even deploying to half squads and hide yourself in these buildings as much as possible and just wait for them to come to you and try and blow you out of those buildings. But you must do that. All right, and that's going to be the initial recce for J1 Urban Guerillas. Again, highly thought of scenario according to a scenario archive, which of course you can trust the stats, right? 7, it's over 7, I think it's 7.5, but again, I'm not quite sure right now. It's highly valued, and it's well balanced given the fact that the win-loss ratio is slightly advanced to the Russians, but it's 55% win for the Russians is not that bad for the German side. Partisans are probably going to play havoc with whatever I just discussed because they're the ultimate wild card. They can pop up anywhere. You could have a half squad show up on X4 with a Panzerfaust as your half track is there, and it quickly starts to decimate your troops, and there's really not much you can do with it. You do have to worry about them being TI on the initial turn they appear, but once that bypasses, they could become a definite hindrance to the German plan, and then you're going to have to divert forces to deal with that. So the Partisans are the ultimate wildcard for this scenario. So overall, I think we're going to have fun with this one. I think it's going to be a blast to play. So let me know what you guys think of Urban Guerillas, if you've played it, how it went for you. I'll point out that Illuminating Rounds has a video of this very scenario that they played, I think it was a year ago, on their site. So look up ASL Illuminating Rounds and look for Urban Guerillas, and you'll see their playthrough if you've never tackled the scenario, just to see how it works. I know that I'm going to be referencing that a lot just to see what worked for them and what didn't work for them. And when I play this with Dave, probably in the next week or so. I think it's long enough for this initial recce, so I'll sign off, and we'll see you guys next video. Okay, bye-bye.